It's the future. A 1, 2, y'all. It's the future. It's the future. There ain't no future unless we build it now. It's the future. A 1, 2, y'all. It's the future. A 1, 2. It's the future. There ain't no future unless we build it now. United States, Africa, we salute ya. A new state of mind, I introduce ya. Close your eyes and visualize the rise of a new paradigm. Solar powered skyscrapers.
Welcome to the Africa Must Unite podcast, a podcast dedicated to inspiring African people worldwide to rise up, organize, and struggle for Pan-Africanism, a unified, liberated, socialist Africa, the only permanent solution to the exploitation and oppression of African people, no matter where they happen to be born or happen to live in the world. Now please, welcome the hosts of Africa Must Unite.
Africa's future is now, so get ready.
Revolutionary and Pan-African greetings, everybody. I'm Mama D.
And I'm Brother Terrence of the Pan-African Revolutionary Socialist Party.
That's right. PRSP, and we are so happy to be with you once again. This is the month of November, Terrence.
Just cruising along here.
Cruising along. We have a real special, I hope, podcast for you today. We saved the United Snakes for last, and we want to get into that right away. But as always, we start off with highlighting a few of our important calendar dates in the month of November from people who contributed to African people and our reality, from progressive revolutionaries from other countries around the world, and of course including our African female warriors. So let us get started with looking at some of these important dates in the month of November. So on the 2nd of November, Assata Shakur, political prisoner, escapes U.S. prison after serving over 6 years of her life sentence in 1979. On the 7th of November, Africans revolted successfully on the slave ship Creole in 1841. On the 8th of November, massive demonstration in Luanda by Angolan people to celebrate their heroic victory over Western imperialism in 1974. On the 11th of November, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Pan-Africanist and wife of W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in 1896. And you know, Terrence, recently we looked at the great contribution that she made in terms of Kwame Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism once he was overthrown and living, even before he was overthrown, when he made her director of Ghana TV. But after he was overthrown, she was powerful in helping to mount the whole Pan-Africanism and making suggestions to him. And they had a wonderful relationship all the way through until he passed. So celebrating Shirley Graham Du Bois today, born on the 11th, 1896. And Nat Turner, too, you know, African freedom fighter, leading the enslaved African people in Southampton, Virginia, to revolt against their enslavement. He was hanged on this day, the 11th, in 1831. On this day also is Angola Political Independence Day that began in 1975. On the 15th of November, the Berlin Conference of Imperialist European countries, and of course the United States as a most interested observer, begins on this date in 1884. And one of the things we're talking about today is the new scramble for Africa. So this is a key point. On this day, too, we want to celebrate Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, Pan-African warrior who died on this day in 1998. In 1636, African General Henrique Diaz won major battle in Brazil against the Dutch. And on the 19th, progressive leader Modibo Keita was overthrown in Mali in 1968. On the 22nd of November, Guinean masses repulsed imperialist aggression in 1970. And, so many people think, Terrence, that, one of the reasons why they mounted such a aggression, the imperialists, was because Nkrumah was living there at the time, and they were really trying to get at him. So, that's important information there. On the 22nd as well, ZANU of Zimbabwe launched guerrilla war in 1972. On the 23rd of November, Morocco began the fight against Spain for the liberation of Spanish Morocco in 1957. On the 25th, U.S. installed Mobutu as the neo-colonial puppet president in Zaire, now Congo Kinshasa, in 1965. And we know how the imperialists, especially the U.S. top dog, can really install a puppet throughout Africa. On this same date, the 25th, we don't want to forget, Pan-African Revolutionary Socialist Party was founded in Washington, D.C. in 1983. I was there, Terrence.
39 years.
And then on the same date, the 25th, Fidel Castro, revolutionary and first president of Socialist Cuba, died in 2016. And one last one, the death of Sojourner Truth on the 26th of November, freedom fighter and women's rights advocate in 1883 that she died. And, her famous speech, "Ain't I a woman? I can do all of this, and I'm still a woman." So those are some important dates in the month of November.
All right. Good dates there, Mama D. Moving into our sub-theme. So again, for those who've been following along, this year's theme has been the African world is on fire. And we are looking at the United States today. So we wrote this in our annual calendar here, starting with a quote from Kwame Nkrumah. It was actually from a letter that he sent to Grace and James on December 9th, 1968. Nkrumah said, quote, "How can there be a nation without political power? It is a contradiction in terms. The, quote, black nation, unquote, can only come into existence when Africa is totally free and an all-African union government has been formed. It is totally unrealistic to think that a, quote, black nation, unquote, can be created on American soil, since no black power movement can possibly succeed in seizing political control of the present white power structure in the USA. Hence, the great importance I attach to the identification of the Black Power revolutionary movement in the USA with the African Revolution," end quote. So after Nkrumah says that, we go on to say, the United States is a settler colony, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, and the leading imperialist force in the world. The 400 wealthiest capitalists saw their collective fortunes increase 40% to $4.5 trillion over last year. The richest of the three richest of these include Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who was at 201 billion at that time, Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, and now Twitter. So his fortune was at 190.5 billion at the time, but we know that's went up. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and Instagram, whose fortune is at 134.5 billion. These capitalists have tax loopholes that the rest of the people do not enjoy. Living in the belly of the capitalist beast, Africans suffer the most. Economically, these 400 capitalists own more wealth than all African households combined, with a lot left over. Because of domestic colonialism, an African family in the U.S. earns about 60 cents for every dollar that a European family earns. The median African family wealth is just 2% of the wealth that the median European family owns. Socially, since slavery, Africans in the U.S. experience horrific conditions. Although only 14% of the total population, they suffer 40% of the homelessness in the U.S. They are disproportionately plagued with hypertension, stroke, cancer, and heart disease. They experience a large percent of COVID-related deaths due to the poor health and due to there being the majority of frontline workers. Moreover, arrests and incarcerations are higher among Africans than any other group. For example, African women or men is 6 times likely or more likely to face jail time for the same drug offense that of a European individual. In fact, Africans make up more than 50% of the prison population in the U.S. These systemic problems, along with the prevalence of dilapidated housing, poor education systems, and ongoing police terrorism throughout the African community, results in the African-on-African killings we see highlighted by mass media on a nightly basis. Africans in the United Snakes are indeed undeniably on fire.
Man, that's a powerful thing, you know, and not just here, but as you mentioned, throughout the world, you know, being victimized for hundreds and hundreds of years and still paying the consequences of that victimization, and in turn being considered, you know, criminals based on how all these hundreds of years of your treatment and our reaction to your treatment. And then, you know, it's just a vicious system, capitalism in all of its forms. And Terrence, I just wanted to mention, you know, that quote that you read from Kwame Nkrumah's letter to Grace and James Boggs. You know, they were living in Detroit, and they were a part of quite a few people trying to talk about and struggle for a black nation. And one of the things we know that Osagyefo always tried to do was share what he knew. And he shared that, you know, with Grace and James Boggs. There cannot be any black nation, you know, outside of Africa. I mean, how can you do it, as you mentioned, with 14% of the population in terms of being Africans inside the U.S.? So it's just another example of trying to share what he learned and what he knew about our road forward, which, of course, we always say is Pan-Africanism. But, you know, that whole piece that you read, as you said, was a part of our calendar 2022 put out in December. And we know, you know, conditions throughout the world, including Africa and the whole global Africa, are dynamic, always changing. And, you know, since putting out that piece, we know that changes have occurred in the United Snakes as well as throughout the rest of the world. And so today, you know, we are highlighting these changing conditions. Really, what we're saying is worsening conditions regarding Africans that are the victims of U.S., whether we talk externally in terms of imperialism or internally in terms of capitalism. And we say, if you want to be literal, United States, we say because they're slithering and vicious as snakes, we say United Snakes, but we never say America, because there's North America, of which United States is a part. There's South America, Central America. So don't claim that title as if you are the America, you know. So, you know, capitalists have to be put up in their place. But we want to go on. We're just trying to highlight some of the things about the United Snakes today. And one of the things we want to say is that today, you know, the United Snakes shows our people what capitalism leads to: fascism, here in the U.S. and abroad. The U.S. is a fascist, capitalist, imperialist nation. That it is undeniable. Fascism views imperialism, political violence, and war as a means to holding on to power. They divide and try to conquer. The core components of fascism always include authoritarianism, nationalism, most prominent of which is racial nationalism, and what we say is racism, elitism, militarism, anti-egalitarianism, and totalitarianism. All of these components are blatantly visible in wherever the U.S. operates, whether at home here, in this territory that's stolen from the Native Americans, the indigenous people, or whether outside of the United States. So, the first thing we want to say is the U.S. is still right now the preeminent imperialist power in the world. And we know that imperialism just means capitalism operating abroad. That's all. So the same ruling class that operates here in the U.S. Are the imperialists that's operating at home in Africa. And, the capitalist imperialists, as we see what's happening today in Ukraine and everywhere throughout the world, and Africa with AFRICOM, all of that always promotes itself using the same old lie about its operation in the world. And that is, we're saving the people. We are humanitarian, we're out to save the people. And, we have enough information in history to know better than that. But then you have these liberal scholars who come along, who promote, the need to develop what they call a humanist capitalist path, as if capitalism and imperialism and humanism are not contradictory terms. How can an economic system that by its very nature terms that exploits and oppress, how can that economic system be made humanist?
Right.
By its definition, it is designed to exploit and oppress for 1% of the population. So, we have to be careful. You read these liberal scholars, I don't care if they're African or European, trying to fix capitalism, to try to make it a little better so that we won't bleed so much as African people and poor and struggling people throughout the world. So I say that because there's so much going on now, pushed by even not just the capitalists, but liberal scholars who might write on Counterpunch and other places. And you have to use our incrumus analysis to deal with that. And so we, as revolutionary scholars, or those who are of us who studied history and who promote a socialist path, we know that capitalism is rotten to its core and must be destroyed. The U.S. knows that, and we know that, retaining its dominance in the world, remaining the reigning power in the world, depends on the continual and increased exploitation of Africa. I don't care if you talk about any other part of the world. No, it depends on the continual and increased exploitation of Africa, and depends on its continual divide and conquer tactics, keeping Africans everywhere, at home and abroad, not only exploited and oppressed, but fighting and killing one another. So the real adversaries of the U.S., we're not falling for what the liberal scholars say, like, these other powers out there. No, the real adversaries of the U.S. are Africa and its people. And the fundamental thing is keeping us divided and killing one another, and not trying to struggle for Pan-Africanism. So, the fundamental question that all must ask is, where are the natural resources, the raw materials coming from that enable the U.S. to reign supreme? They ain't reigning nothing. without these resources. And all throughout this year, turns, throughout 2022, our party, the Pan-African Revolutionary Socialist Party, has been highlighting the many resources that the U.S. and other world powers are stealing from Africa. And just a few examples should suffice. In the Congo, an estimated 24 trillion in natural wealth, including copper, diamonds, tin, gold, and close to 70% of global cobalt production. Libya, the access to oil and gold and the smashing of Gaddafi's Pan-African projects, which would have helped prevent the looting of Africa and to promote a unified socialist Africa, would have brought us closer to Pan-Africanism. Mozambique, liquefied natural gas that's being stolen, timber that's being stolen, rubies that are being stolen. In Nigeria, crude oil, natural gas, coal, and columbite. In Zimbabwe has the largest lithium deposits in Africa. And lithium are needed for the very drones that are sent to Africa to kill. The lithium is there. So you're not going to be the big top dog of nothing without Africa. And you can't be an exploiter of Africa unless you keep the people divided. And the way you keep the people divided is to set them against one another, to deal with, what we used to call tribal warfare, ethnic conflicts. And you see it going on all throughout Africa. So, what we say is that what capitalism is doing abroad and here in the U.S. is clear to all of us who are engaged in the liberation and unification of Africa under socialist economic system. It's the same old tactics out of the same old playbook. Divide and conquer, murder if necessary. And in this fascist reality, all of its tactics are clear and above board. It's no hiding anymore. They bold. You can see what they're doing clearly. It's for all of us to witness. Keep African people throughout the world at war among themselves so that the ruling class can enrich themselves.
You're right. And that's the external situation right there. Now, internally, what you see externally on the international stage, you see internally on the national stage. The ruling class is the same. It's the same old tactics from the same old playbook. The desire to be top dog abroad as well as here in the U.S. The U.S. is the preeminent capitalist nation in the world. Capitalism is an economic system in which those things that we need to survive are owned by a few, the capitalist ruling class, who exploit and oppress the workers for profit. In order to remain top dog in the world, the ruling class inside the U.S. must also keep the people divided. What is the consequence of this divide and conquer strategy? Simply the perpetuation of racism, the handmaiden of capitalism, that's what racism is, the institutional structures throughout the U.S. and the rest of the developed world are reflected in differential treatment accorded European migrants versus African migrants, racial profiling and police brutality, the refusal to teach about harmful effects of slavery and its aftermath, the refusal to acknowledge the continuation of present-day racism, thus the perpetuation of the slave era stereotypes depicting Africans as lazy and undeserving of assistance. The European Christian fascism that one witnesses today is given birth by today's fascist capitalism. The capitalist ruling class encourages, relies on, and enables white supremacy, and from time to time it even stokes the flames. In other words, for the ruling class to remain empowered, to retain its hegemony, it must incite division and conflict within the U.S. It must divide and conquer just as it does in its imperialist disguise. And as a consequence, just as in Africa, so too in the U.S., Africans are divided and at war with one another.
Wow. It is something when you put it all together, isn't it, Terrence? It's just, but it's, we keep going back to it. It's the same old tactics. You go back and read Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You know what I mean? It's the same old tactics that were used then that's used now. Nothing new. It's just very blatant and above board. But this is how you can continue to rule. Don't look at us, the capitalist ruling class. Don't look at us as your enemy. Look at each other as your enemy. And that's fascist capitalism today, when it's so open and above board, when you use anything militarily and any other kind of thing to survive and to stay top dog. So, we get to the point of saying, well, what is the impact of the U.S. fascist capitalism on African people in order for the ruling European class to maintain its power? And we're looking inside the U.S. and we say, Terrence, that we can look at 5 indices always as socialists we look at to gauge the health of the society, the well-being of the people. And we look at food, we look at housing, employment, health, and education. And in all of these categories, and you talked about this in that introduction to, our calendar for November, all of these categories, the African in the U.S., due to today's fascist capitalism and its birth child racism, is faring poorly at best and dying at worst. And so, Terrence, I know this sounds silly, but I remember when I was young, I don't know if you remember, I Spy, playing the game I Spy when you were growing up. And that is, what do you see when you walk the streets of the U.S.? I spy this. And that's what we used to say as kids. But you can spy so much of the devastation that's going on in terms of African people. Very sad. And we don't even mention COVID here and how many hundreds of thousands of people it killed of us, and so many of us, because we had those pre-existing conditions that you mentioned when you read, the calendar piece for November. But look at this. I mean, you walk out my door, I see Africans collecting cans to make ends meet. I want people around the world to know what it means to be an African today living in the U.S. For so many of us, Africans sleeping on bus stop benches because they have no other place to go. Homeless people with their belongings, we see them in backpacks, in suitcases, in carts. Africans holding up cardboard signs on the street, begging for any change you can give them. Tent cities all over the place. You go to any city, major city in the United States, and on the thing is so sad, on Martin Luther King Jr. boulevards and avenues throughout the U.S., you see tents pitched because of the homeless and people sleeping and staying there. Tent cities all over the place. Our people sleeping in their cars because they can't afford both rent and gas to go to work. So they have to give up their apartments or whatever they have. Our people succumbing to drugs being dumped in our communities. And when I listen to the news, Terrence, this is what I spy, or this is what I hear. Africans live in poverty 3 times the rate of Europeans. We make up most of the 11 million households who spend more than half of their income on rent. It's a festering, affordable housing plight that gets worse each month. Many of us, number 3, are considered the working poor. During the pandemic, those of us working in meat packing plants, for example, were given hair nets to cover our nose. We asked for masks, and they gave us hair nets to cover our nose and face to protect against COVID-19. And we were not tested. We were not told who had the disease and who didn't. We rode the same bus back and forth with everybody else, some who were sick and some who weren't, going to these meat packing plants. Africans today, Terrence, turning more and more to drugs to ameliorate the pain. More Africans today, 2-3 years ago, it was not this way. But today, more Africans take fentanyl and fentanyl-laced products than Europeans in the United States. Young African females who can't afford to buy sanitary napkins, a non-profit organization had to step into help. I mean, basic stuff. African mothers who can't afford to buy Pampers for their babies, so a non-profit organization stepped in to help. African girls who go missing and not investigated, because when African females are missing, they are said to be runaways, promiscuous, deviant. Their lives don't matter. So some sisters founded a National Black and Missing Foundation so that we can check on our own young sisters who are missing. Africans having to depend on food pantries to eat despite their receiving SNAP or food stamps because groceries have gone up 13%. More than 1 million new seniors have fallen into poverty this year, mostly us, since the pandemic. 40% of African women who are unmarried face poverty. All in all, Terrence, we can go on, but the bottom line is that the increase in class exploitation and national race oppression is amazing. And, it's just amazing. I don't even want to keep hammering that, but things have gotten worse because we're living in a fascist state. And so things have gotten worse for our people, and we see it every day.
Yes, indeed. Let's take a look at what this U.S. fascist system has on African youth in particular. So one of the most important registers in measuring the threat that youth pose in a society can be found in how it treats its youth. African youth in the U.S. are the ones most ensnared by the fascist capitalism. Because African youth and youth in general are the spark for revolutionary change in the society, they are seen as a threat to fascist capitalism. The capitalists/imperialists must prevent the emergence conscious youth, both at home and abroad, who will lead the way toward Pan-Africanism and thus prevent the continuing rape of our homeland. And they will do anything in their means, our enemy, to prevent the unification of global African youth. And so, what do we see happening? Our youth are being increasingly demonized, criminalized, and murdered. Example A here would be they are disproportionately arrested in relation to European youth, vastly overrepresented in juvenile detention centers, 9 times more likely than European children to receive adult prison sentences, and disproportionately suspended and expelled from schools as a result of zero tolerance laws. If you check the book Way Down Under, you'll see that Africans, many of the youth, are choosing solitary confinement because of the oppression they are experiencing due to their age. Another example is capitalism in its current fascist, racist mode has not only identified or not only define African youth as the enemy, but has also gone to great lengths to keep them submerged in a life of ignorance and death. How does living in the U.S. keep our youth ignorant? It used to be that the streets were where war was waged on African youth, but now the war is waged within major institutions, our schools. No space is safe. For example here, juvenile detention centers are filled with our youth who, because of their treatment in these centers, i.e. repeated acts of physical violence, sexual assault, and psychological torment, try to kill themselves with stunning regularity. African boys 12 and over are not allowed in shelters for mothers and children facing abuse. You have schools for them that are largely modeled after prisons. Books on their history are being banned. Teachers are under siege for not whitewashing history. Public schools, which most of our children, our youth attend, are defunded. Tax credits for poor youth have been rescinded. Those African youth who managed to go to college because of their debt and racism face a bleak future. And in predominantly European communities and schools, African youth who do not fit into a white Euro-Christian Orthodox reality are ostracized. In other words, today's fascist capitalism is killing our youth in the U.S. and it is killing our youth throughout the world.
Wow. And you know, Terrence, I know you know this, but I just found out about this thing called direct file, where youth who get in trouble are sent straight out, only African youth who get in trouble with the law are sent directly to adult courts. They don't even send them to juvenile court. They can be 13, they can be 14, they can be 15 directly. And this is why, you know, sometimes these places will put these younger youth in solitary confinement, or the youth will opt to go into solitary confinement, because you can imagine what happens to them, you know, on that if they're in a cell or in the vicinity with older prisoners, you know. So it's just a devastating thing. But as you said, you know, today's fascist capitalism at home and abroad, it's killing African youth. So we're not just talking about the United States, we're talking about throughout the world. And why? Because the U.S. is the biggest imperialist power in the world. So you can't talk internally, nationally, about the U.S. only. You have to always talk about externally, internationally, its role as an international reality, as an imperialist power. And we are one people. And so we're not saying just us in the U.S. No, throughout the African world, look at what this fascist U.S. is doing to us. So we just want to conclude by saying this. The fascist reality of the U.S. abroad and at home leaves us no choice but to recognize the following. One, the primary role that Africa plays in the U.S.'s quest to remain the reigning power in the world, and the quest of Europeans here inside the U.S. and throughout the world to remain the top dog and the face of the ruling class. Therefore, you know, the primary quest of global Africans throughout the African world, must be a unified socialist Africa. It must be Pan-Africanism. If we're going to survive, everybody, if we're going to survive, y'all, we got to talk about bringing into existence Pan-Africanism. It will provide the quickest relief from our exploitation and oppression worldwide. And Pan-Africanism also will be the most important contribution that can be made to the attainment of worldwide socialism, leading to worldwide communism. African people and people of African descent, in order to survive, we repeat, we have no choice but to join a revolutionary socialist organization dedicated to building Pan-Africanism.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, Terrence. Absolutely.
So people all throughout 2022 and at the times of help from invited guests, we have one more month left here. We focused on our calendar theme, which is the African world is on fire. We've highlighted the killing effects of living in a capitalist imperialist world, showing why capitalism in all of its forms must be destroyed. Only Pan-Africanism leading to world communism can solve our people's and the people's exploitation and oppression.
So we ask you to please join us next month when we will talk in detail about why Pan-Africanism is the only permanent solution and the quickest solution for our exploitation and oppression.
Meanwhile, visit us at our website, PanAfricanRevolutionarySocialistParty.org. Again, that's one word, PanAfricanRevolutionarySocialistParty.org. You can email us at PanAfricanRSP@gmail.com. You can like us on SoundCloud, visit us on YouTube, and leave comments on our Facebook page, which is Pan-African Socialists.
Remember, organization is the key. Join us, the Pan-African Revolutionary Socialist Party, or some other revolutionary Pan-African socialist organization. We say, and we always say, and we believe wholeheartedly that a union of African socialist states is on the horizon.
Are the ones who gonna have to fight. We used to say, which side are you on? Which side are you on? The truth is, we're in so much debt that the only way out is revolution or war. So now the question is, which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, my Lord? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, my Lord?
See, before I draw the line, let me welcome you close to all the folks who knew Obama sold the people a hoax. Gave the money to suckers while our community still poor. Withdrew the troops but started another war. Colonizing, terrorizing, creating the oil crisis so they can make a killing on food and gas prices. Prisons is filling, they trying to lock up the future. Militarized borders and control of computers. Want a stupid bumping music that ain't healthy for the shortest. Privatizing schools and policemen in the hallways. Can't be dormant, I woke and rise up, be ready. Brought the family with us and we hold the machetes.
Riding the fence, too many people be riding the fence. Yeah, you say you ready for war, but are you convinced? I'm not convinced. If you're a rider, freedom fighter, crowd excited, then let's do this. We can make one big united, middle finger to the US. Give me the bravest and the truest, fuck the hippest and the coolest. We gon' spark this revolution and cross this off our to-do list. Put your foot down if you look down on this criminal system. Put your book down and get shook down like my niggas in prison. They'll be condemning and condoning their actions in one sentence. Make up your mind, choose your side. Is you a patriot or a menace to society? So riot or sit by quietly, but don't pull out your flag and try to say you gon' ride with me. You flip-flopping like hip-hop, I don't get locked in that trick box. Get got like Big and Pop, shit's got to stop. I am the people, not the big, I repeat after Fred. So please blow my brains out if I ever forget.
I'm with the independent thinkers, I'm down with the movers and the shakers and the ex-Henny drinkers, the non-smokers, the health advocates, the non-voters, the young bloods in the hood training like soldiers. I'm on the side of the tracks with the hood gardens, the little child that don't color inside the margins. I don't ride the fence, I cultivate my strength, cause if it ain't about power, it don't make sense. I've been down with Boogie Down since BDP, some Brown Pride, and Black Power make RBG. A OG told me choose battles wisely. In the struggle, don't forget your children and your wifey. If you don't see me on the podium preaching it, every day I hope my every action is teaching it. Cause revolution is a process, it's not a speech or a panel. It bite off more than you can handle.
I still rock hard like slingshots in Palestina. Con todos los estudiantes por educación gratuita. I'm with workers uprising and the right to unionize. We ain't crossed the border, so you better legalize. I'm with La Peña del Bronx, I'm still with Vitor Toro, cause gentrification is polluting my borough. So bro never, South Bronx forever. Decolonize the block, make your neighborhood better. I ain't down with the rich, I'm more Richie Perez. Don't talk to grand juries or cooperate with feds. I'm with students, doctors, janitors, teachers. We need living wages, but they don't believe us. Monida, Barretto, Spofford, Punch Point, my hood, I love. We join forces, forming our deck, BX. Taking over buildings, rebel Diaz for the children.
Politics to sickness, streets express symptoms. Caught up with a quickness, big business pimps them. Scholars play the simpleton, fools play with wisdom. Who will stand and fight back? Who will play the victim? Trials and tribulations, injured generations, stolen history and outsourced innovation. Babel Tower fell, tribes are at war. The battle story's not represented in the score. The game's fixed, most of the faces and names switched. Credit stolen for art, science, religion, language, technology, philosophy, and what strange is. They paid in hatred for the knowledge of the ancients. Power in words, actions, guns, swords. Aim Panthers, brown berets, young lords. Pick a side, one sickness, one cure, one love, one blood, one world, but one war.